that was the time when almost the whole world was busy with South Africa, apartheid, sanctions against the regime in Pretoria. And Desmond Tutu, who was at that time the Secretary General of the Southern Africa Council of Churches, was one of the key people who gave us advice and motivation. So he has always been a person very close to us and very dear to our heart. Since then, we met with him on a number of occasions. Last, I think, was when he obtained the honorary doctorate of the University of Vienna in 2009. And I mean, he has been given, I don't know how many honorary doctorates of universities worldwide, but the University of Vienna and the Faculty of Theology in particular made it a point that while recognizing his merits and his contribution towards human rights, non-racism, they gave him the doctorate for his contribution to theology. And I think Archbishop Tutu's theology will play a role tonight in this lecture. As you all know, the 90th birthday, his 90th birthday was on October 7. We celebrated earlier already when we highlighted the contribution made to a free and democratic South Africa, both by Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu on 18th of July. As you know, this is the International Nelson Mandela Day, which we celebrate every year in Vienna on the square, which has been named after Nelson Mandela. And so this year it was not only Nelson Mandela who stood in the center of our celebration, but also Desmond Tutu as well. We wanted then to have this lecture in October, but for various reasons we had to postpone, and we are so happy that today turned out to be a suitable date to have this lecture. In a series, we have these lectures every month actually, and this will be also the end of the series for this year. And I would also like to commend the Desmond and Leah Tutu Foundation in Cape Town for the work they are doing to keep the Tutus, both Tutu spirits alive. And if you have a chance to visit Cape Town, please also visit the interesting exhibition of the Tutu Foundation there. I would like to express our gratitude to our speaker tonight, who agreed to make himself available. Professor Tinyiko Maluleke is a prominent and internationally recognized researcher in his field, specialized in religion and politics, as well as Black and African theologies. So he is a theologian. At the same time, he has served in various executive positions in 3 South African universities, namely UNISA, which he transformed in a considerable way, the University of Johannesburg and the University of Pretoria. He is still now professor and deputy director of the University of Pretoria's Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. He is also an elected member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. But a few days ago only, the Tshwane University of Technology has appointed Professor Maluleke as its next president, I think starting from February. And I want to congratulate you, Professor Maluleke, for this appointment, and also wish you all the best for this, I am sure, very challenging task. I was privileged to be introduced to Professor Maluleke when he was in Vienna. He visited Vienna twice in 2015 and 2018, and we maintained contact since then. And I should also mention that in the last edition of our magazine in Daba, he contributed an article on Desmond Tutu's humor. The title is "Let Us Celebrate His Afro-Christian Humor." I don't know if you can see this article, which was well received by the public in Austria. Before we hand over the floor to Professor Maluleke, I think there is a few technical announcements, and I would like to ask Nina Herzog and Helena Hornung to make us familiar with the technical proceedings.
All right, thank you very much, Walter, and thank you also, Professor, to be here. We will just give you like a quick introduction. I'm sure that most of the people already know how to work Zoom, but just in case. And I think it shouldn't be a problem that it's in German. But as you can see, we would kindly ask you to mute yourself during the presentation. Otherwise, we will just have too much background noise. And you're also able to disable your camera actually, so that we don't experience any lagging in the video. And if there's any questions regarding the presentation, you can just write in the chat, either like I have a question, and then later we can answer those questions, or Professor Maluleke can decide if he wants to pick it up maybe during the presentation already. Otherwise, if you experience any technical difficulties, you're also very welcome to just message us directly if you don't want to put it in the comment chat. And last but not least, we would inform you that we are recording the session. And if this is not okay for you, if you don't want your name to be mentioned, then you can just go on the icon to change your name. But I think most of the people should be all right with this. This is just for your information. Yeah, other than that, I think I didn't forget anything. We're good to go. We're really happy to have you here. And Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I had to unmute myself first. I am honored that at least two of the people in the audience are my students. I've taught them one way or the other, Lerato and one of the technicians who are helping us today. My dear friend, Dr. Walter Sauer, friends, and the staff of the South African of the Austrian Documentation Center in Vienna, formerly known as the Austrian Anti-Apartheid Organization. Colleagues and friends from here in Austria, from Switzerland, from Germany, from the USA, a few friends that promised that they would join us. I greet you all. I have only been to Vienna twice in my life. In my view, it is the most beautiful and the most culture-rich European cities I've ever visited. It is for me noteworthy that our host, the Austrian organization, now called the South African Documentation Center, was one of the many organizations that were formed worldwide in order to combat the evil system of apartheid particularly after the Soweto student uprising of 1976 and after the death of Steve Biko in police custody in September 1977. But what warms my heart about the work of Dr. Sawa and his colleagues at the Documentation Center is its longevity. Unlike many anti-apartheid organizations which were only too eager to close shop after the release of political prisoners in 1990 and after the South African democratic elections of 1994, the Austrian Documentation Center in Vienna has continued, and it has adapted its work from purely anti-apartheid activism to documentation as well as advocacy work for several post-colonial Southern African countries. Dr. Sawa and the Documentation Center are therefore the tried and tested friends of South Africa. Before getting into my talk proper, let me start with a disclaimer. For all the marketing pretensions of the title of my talk, it is not the gospel according to Desmond Tutu himself. A more accurate statement of the title would be something like Tinyiko Maluleke's desperate attempt to work out what he thinks the gospel according to Desmond Tutu might look like. But I thought such a title might not attract many people. So I went for the slightly more marketable title that you have. Let me start with the introduction to my talk. Whereas he was a persona non grata in the country of his birth, when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984, Desmond Tutu was described by his friend and colleague, Simon Kubule, who accompanied him to Norway, as someone who was neglected in his own country. And he said, and I quote, "In his own country, this man did not receive even the courtesy of a congratulations from the government. Even liberal institutions like universities in the country have not given him the honor he deserves," end of quote. This was then. More recently, the global church, his native country, and the world at large have recognized the gift that this small man from Soweto, said his colleague Archbishop Ndungane, small man from Soweto, who was once hated without a cause, said Simon Kubule, has since been recognized for who he is and the gift that he is. Not so long ago, there was a football player who plays for Henderson FC at the Solomon Islands. He is a goalkeeper, and his name is Desmond Tutu. So he took both name and surname. His parents gave it to him as his name. Desmond and the Tutus is also the name of a Pretoria rock band, which was formed by 4 young white men in 2005. Shane Durant, Craig Durant, Douglas Bauer, and Nicholas Dini. They are the members of Desmond and the Tutus. In 2006, the Desmond and Leah Tutu pedestrian bridge, a bridge that flies over a very busy road in Johannesburg, and a bridge that links 2 famous Anglican schools, one for girls and the other for boys, was designed by a largely white group of students from my university where I work now, the University of Pretoria. On occasion of his 86th birthday, the city of Cape Town built what they call the Ark of the Arch in the heart of Cape Town, just to honor Desmond Tutu. And who can ever forget the bewildering, slow-cooking jazz song named Tutu, which was done by the one and only Miles Davis. Similarly, in the chart-topping 1988 hit, in his chart-topping 1988 hit, Guyanese British singer Eddie Grant, whose song he titled "Give Me Hope, Joanna," respectfully refers in that song to Desmond Tutu as the preacher who works for Jesus, the archbishop who is a peaceful man, who together say that the freedom fighters will overcome the very strong. More recently, in 2018, scientists Rob Guess, a South African, and Per Alberg, a Swedish scientist, together discovered an ancient four-legged fish species, and they named it after Desmond Tutu because they thought that these tetrapods, as they are called, led the way from these rather anoxic swamps out into the sunshine, a metaphor for what Desmond Tutu has done for his country and for the world. As I speak to you, there is an amazing Desmond Tutu exhibition of pictures, words, sound, and video orchestrated by the Apartheid Museum to celebrate the 90th birthday of the Archbishop Emeritus. I participated in the creation of that. But perhaps one of the greatest honors ever bestowed on Tutu is not the honorary doctorates, the influential positions, the titles, but rather it may be a handwritten letter from a group of primary school kids from Fellview Primary in Wigton, UK, who in 2006 wrote this letter and signed it one by one, each of them. In it, the children described Tutu, among others, as generous, mindful, caring, honest, polite, and a good listener. He might not have agreed with them on each of the generous character traits they attributed to him, but he surely did appreciate this simple but most profound gesture from kids. Now, the principles behind the gospel according to Desmond Tutu. I share 5 principles behind the gospel according to Desmond Tutu. There are more, and I'm sure that I could give you 10 if you pressed me, but for the purposes of this lecture, I'll give you 5. The first principle of the gospel according to Desmond Tutu is that God is not a Christian. And Tutu would add that neither the church nor Christians have, and I quote, an exclusive proprietary claim on God. And therefore, nobody holds exclusive copyright on the gospel of Jesus Christ, if only because for him, that is Tutu, God is not a Christian. Who better to illustrate this than Desmond Tutu himself? And I want to quote him again. God is clearly not a Christian. His concern is for all his children. There is a Jewish story which says that soon after the episode of the drowning of the Egyptians in the Red Sea while the Israelites were celebrating, God accosted them and demanded, "How can you rejoice when my children have drowned?" End of quote. Unfortunately, Tutu does not tell us how the Israelites of biblical times responded to God's pointed question at that time. Did they say to God, "But God, we thought we alone are your children," so that God proceeded to give them a lesson on his fatherhood of all people? Perhaps they said to God, "Your promises were made to Abraham, our ancestor, and therefore the land of milk and honey is our inheritance alone." Maybe they said, "The Egyptians may be your stepchildren, but we are legitimate children who also happen to be your favorite children." To this, God might have responded by explaining that their salvation, that is the Israelite salvation, was a small part of a much larger plan to save the world and to save the people of the whole world. It must have been Tutu's belief in the principle of God not being a Christian that enabled him to form a strong bond of friendship with His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso. Elsewhere, Tutu explains the principle of God not being a Christian further, and I quote him, "My God, and I hope your God, is not sitting around apprehensive that a profound religious truth or a major scientific discovery is going to be made by a non-Christian. God rejoices that his human creatures, irrespective of race, culture, gender, or religious faith, are making exhilarating advances in science, in art, in music, in ethics, philosophy, and law, apprehending the increasing ability to describe the truth, beauty, and goodness. And we should all join in the divine exaltation and rejoice that there have been wonderful people such as Socrates, Aristotle, Herodotus, Hippocrates, Confucius, and others. Isn't it obvious that Christians do not have a monopoly on virtue, on intellectual capacity, on aesthetic know-how? And wonderfully, it does not matter. And on goes Tutu with that train of thought. He makes it clear that for God, there are
I'm not sure if it's only us or if we are experiencing some issues.
No, me too.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess it's the internet connection, which was a bit unstable before. So we just wait and hope that it will be resolved. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think there might be just a problem. Ah, he's back. Yeah.
okay, shall I switch off my video and see
Yeah.
if it helps? Where Tutu was talking about a monopoly of virtue. In this quote, he makes it clear that for God, there are no Christians and no people of different religions. They are just, because all of these which have been decreed or ordained by God, obviously influenced by the context of racial discrimination in apartheid South Africa. Desmond Tutu points out in this quote that the crucial fact is that no religion, no nationality, no gender, and no race has a monopoly on righteousness, intelligence, or aesthetic talent. The second principle of the gospel, according to Tutu, derives in part from the first, namely the principle that all people are God's children. It is perhaps the most fundamental of Tutu's principles, out of which comes much of his theology and much of his political activism. Exactly 37 years and 3 days ago, on the 11th of December 1984, Desmond Tutu delivered his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. It is a speech steeped in the principle of God's inclusive love for all people. And he started the speech by saying, "I come from a beautiful land, richly endowed by God with wonderful natural resources, wide expanses, rolling mountains, singing birds, bright shining stars out of the blue skies, with radiant sunshine, golden sunshine. There's enough of good things that come from God's bounty. But in pursuance of apartheid's ideological racist dream, over 300,000 of God's children have been uprooted from their homes, and these homes have been demolished." And then he goes on to talk about the situation of Black people. From this quote, it is clear that what kept Tutu awake at night at this time, that is at the time of his receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize, was how the children whom God had placed on a beautiful and fertile of the African continent are so racially divided that while a few have everything, the vast majority were dying of hunger and of an inferior education system. This being something else he spoke about in his speech. He spoke to his country, he spoke about a country in which one minority government ruthlessly ruled the Black majority with an iron fist. In fact, he began his speech by making reference to two tragic and needless deaths of two children, one Black and one white. All this because one group of God's children would not share with the other group of God's children. And he ended by saying, "Unless we work assiduously so that all of God's children, our brothers and sisters, members of our one human family, all will enjoy basic human rights, the right to a fulfilled life, the right of movement, of work, of freedom to be fully human, with a humanity measured by nothing less than the humanity of Jesus Christ himself." Now imagine this. This is Tutu preaching the gospel of the humanity of Jesus Christ, otherwise now known as Christology, in front of a largely non-religious audience of Nobel Committee members and reviewers. He makes a crucial link between the notion of all being God's children with the ideas of one human family whose members enjoy basic human rights. It's amazing how his notion of God being, all being God's children is linked to the notion of basic human rights. In the process, Tutu warns that unless the world changes its ways, the world is on the way to global suicide, his own words. As shown in the quotations, the principle that all people are God's children is not only about Black and white or denominational relations. This is a principle that buoyed Tutu to fight for women's rights inside and outside the church. This is the principle that made him so unpopular when he argued that all are made in the image of God. Therefore, the church has no right to discriminate against members of the LGBTI plus community. The third principle in the gospel, according to Desmond Tutu, is namely that of honoring one's parents. All the 6 or so biographies of Desmond Tutu concur that the influence of his parents, both of whom he loved deeply, loomed large in his life. He says of his mother, "My mother was a washerwoman, and I went with her to her white madam where she worked. She died the year I got the Nobel Peace Prize." And he often made jokes about the fact that his big nose takes after the big nose of his own mother. While his relationship with his father was not always easy, Tutu also says about his father, and I quote, "I loved my father very much, and while his temper pained me greatly, there was so much about him that was loving, wise, and witty." End of quote. Tutu has battled to forgive himself for missing the final opportunity to speak to his father before his father died. In a recent article, I contrast the game-changing, albeit sometimes painful, relationship which both Desmond Tutu and Elie Wiesel, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, Tutu, had with their fathers. I also contrast their views on memory. It seems to me that Elie Wiesel found his life purpose the day his father was beaten to death by the Nazis at Auschwitz. "Elisa, my son, come here. I want to tell you something. Only to you. Come, don't leave me alone, Elisa." His father cried out, even as the fists were raining on him and he was being beaten by baseball bats by the Nazi police. But Elie, who was only a young boy, was too scared for his own life. As he later described it in a speech, when his father was killed, he was there, but he was not there. And this is how he made it his job for the rest of his life to combat indifference and historical amnesia. He was convinced that the Holocaust was facilitated by human indifference to the pain and suffering of others. While Desmond Tutu's relationship with his father was nothing that dramatic and certainly nothing that tragic, the two men, that is Desmond and Elie, were nevertheless greatly influenced to do good by the life-changing experiences they had in the company of their own fathers. The influence of Tutu's mother on him is beyond question. Elsewhere, I've argued that it is not possible to understand Tutu's approach to forgiveness and reconciliation without appreciating his relationship with his parents. Tutu has often reminisced about his childhood, about, and I quote, how he had built his own toy cars with discarded boot polish tins and scraps of wire during the Christmas holidays, and about how he would visit his grandmother at Stettenville in the East Rand, where the whole community would share a single tap of water. Now, maybe the children of Wigton Primary School in the UK, to whom I referred earlier, were not so wrong in suggesting that Tutu had a happy childhood. In much of his reminiscing, he projects a largely happy childhood. But it was by no means an easy childhood. There was no easy childhood for a Black child born. It became even worse after 1948 when apartheid took over. For Tutu personally, his childhood was made additionally difficult when he contracted such life-threatening diseases as tuberculosis and spent 2 years at a tuberculosis hospital in Johannesburg. And I quote from him, he says, "One day I was in the bathroom coughing up blood. It was not just coming in isolated drops. I was hemorrhaging. The blood was coming like a flow. I knew what this signified. The doctors knew it too. Your young friend is not going to make it," they had told Trevor Huddleston. They didn't have to tell me. I had seen it before. I knew. In the short, shuddering breaths between coughs, I spoke to God saying, "Well, God, if I'm going to die, it's okay. And if not, that's okay too." Later on, Desmond Tutu explained that when he said this, he was not giving up on life. He was just, in his own words, resting in God's presence. The fourth principle in the gospel, according to Tutu, is that there really is no future without forgiveness. Tutu believes so strongly that there is no future without forgiveness, so that he wrote 3 books on this subject, on the subject of forgiveness and reconciliation. The first book was titled No Future Without Forgiveness, which was his own reflections on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The last 2 books were written with his daughter, Mpilo, one titled Made for Goodness and the other titled The Book of Forgiving. For Tutu, forgiveness is as necessary for life as oxygen. In their book of Forgiving, Mpilo and Desmond Tutu put it this way, and I quote them: "We would like to share with you 2 simple truths. There is nothing that cannot be forgiven, and there is no one undeserving of forgiveness. When you can see that we are all bound to one another, whether by birth, by circumstance, or simply by our shared humanity, then you will know this to be true. I often said that in South Africa, there would have been no future without forgiveness. Our rage and our quest for revenge would have been our destruction. This is as true for us individually as it is for us globally." End of quote. A recent piece which I published for the International Review of Mission, I try to trace the contextual journey of Desmond Tutu in or with forgiveness and reconciliation. It is a fascinating journey. In a section of this piece, I reflect on the words and phrases that are used in a few South African indigenous languages to express the act and the idea of forgiving and reconciling. In the Nguni languages, which is the language that Tutu himself speaks, notions of forgiveness are captured in the idea of begging for peace, ukucela uxolo, asking for peace, begging for peace. In other words, the contrite offender will go to the person they have offended and say, "I beg for peace, ngicela uxolo." In other words, I have no peace inside me and around me because I have offended you. And until you give me your peace, I will never have peace. And that is the understanding of forgiveness in which Tutu is steeped. So the attainment of peaceable relations is an important objective in any forgiveness process. The one who asks for forgiveness is the one who does not have peace because they have offended or done wrong or sinned against someone else. In the Sotho family of languages, as well as in Xitsonga, which is my language, forgiveness is expressed in the phrase, I am asking for you to hold this for me, or to help me carry this. Ke kopa tshwarelo, help me carry this. This expression has profound implication. It means that as a result of the offense I have committed, or the offender has committed, the offender now carries a burden heavier than their normal carrying capacity or their normal carrying threshold. They walk around with a heavy burden. So they go back to the people or person they have offended and they this burden. And you help them carry the burden by forgiving them. So picture this. Two people who have forgiven one another actually walk together, carrying together the load that used to be carried only by one of them. And I think it's important to understand these notions if we are to appreciate why Tutu looks like he is soft on forgiveness and soft on reconciliation, which is far, very far from the truth. The last principle of the gospel, according to Desmond Tutu, is that while God may not be Christian, God is always on the side of the oppressed, which Desmond Tutu called the winning side. He sometimes called it the side of goodness. So, at the height of apartheid repression, Desmond Tutu would declare with confidence that God is on our side. And he would say this in many political funerals, in front of the police and in front of the state officials. He would say, God is on our side, join the winning side. You are lost on that side. So his idea was that God is found among people who suffer, among the oppressed people, among the neglected and insulted and humiliated and excluded and violated and dehumanized and disenfranchised people. That is where God resides. It does not reside elsewhere. Now, this, of course, is a very difficult theological precept to hold, especially when, as Alan Busak says, you find that you may have moved away from one pharaoh in Egypt, but once you have crossed the Red Sea, you find other pharaohs on the other side. This becomes very difficult, especially in post-colonial situations, such as the one in which South Africa finds itself now. We have up to 70% of our young people unemployed, the highest unemployment rate ever experienced in this country. We live in a society which, though we are able and have been able to hold elections regularly and peacefully, we are nevertheless a very violent society. We are also a society where there is a lot of poverty, continued poverty, even after apartheid. Worse still, there is it's not new, because what was apartheid if it was not corruption itself? But now we have corruption at a very grand scale, even corruption during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it seems to me that if Tutu was still active today and still vocal, he would probably re-describe who the oppressed are in ways that are different from the ways that he used to describe them in the 1980s. and in the 1970s. Indeed, in 2016 already, he did that press conference where he warned the government of the ANC and said to them, I warn you, ANC, very soon the people of this country will vote you out of power. That is Desmond Tutu. But I don't think he would have changed the principle of God being on the side of the poor. Let me stop here and hope that I was not disconnected in this section of the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maluleke, for this introduction into what you think is the gospel according to Desmond Tutu. That was extremely interesting, and I'm sure there is a number of questions to ask or refer to the fourth principle. Actually, you said there's no future without forgiveness, and you explained that the concept of forgiving is a traditional South African or African concept, probably. Can we speak about forgiveness without also speaking about how to compensate for the damage done, the injustice? Is it enough just to say, I am sorry, can you share the burden with me? And then is there any consequence?
Yeah, that of course is a brilliant question. It is of course one that I neglected to attend to in my talk, simply because I was not reading everything. But certainly that is what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was supposed to be about, so that there will be truth spoken and that there will also be compensation for the damage done in as far as it is humanly possible. That issues of the grand issues of apartheid, issues of land dispossession, issues of economic exclusion, that these would be addressed as part and parcel of the reconciliation process. Unfortunately, some of the big recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were never taken up by government. And so there is a great deal of anger at the moment, and the danger is there, Walter, that many South Africans might feel exactly what you are expressing, that we have forgiven, but what do we have? Instead, we have nothing, and many young people are making that call more and more, again and again. It came up now when F.W. de Klerk, the former president, died, and there were rumors that he might be given a state funeral, and many people were very upset and did not accept that he should be given a state funeral because they felt he had what he knew, and he had done nothing to compensate for the mayhem and the violence which he oversaw, even during the last years of his presidency. Thanks, Walter.
Thank you. You can ask questions directly, or you can use the chat function, whatever you feel more comfortable with. Edith, I think.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot, Professor, for your great presentation. My question actually links to what Walter has just asked, I think. So I'm wondering what Desmond's perspective would be if the perpetuators won't see the wrongdoings. What is his approach on dealing with it? Does it make sense to you?
I hope this connection of mine, it keeps telling me that it's unstable, but look, Tutu is now a 90-year-old man. He is, for all purposes, really out of the public sphere. His personal influence is no longer as high as it once was. And so I am not sure that it would be fair to expect him to intervene either in terms of or in any other way. You know, he is an old man now to take part in the current debates. Unfortunately, he has left a legacy. I personally don't think that his legacy in and of itself is not, could have been used better by the government, especially his legacy of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, especially his legacy of trying to forge a single and united nation by coining the idea of a rainbow. I think, and becoming an advocate for South Africa all over the world. So I think he's got a legacy on which we can build. I'm not convinced that we have built as well and as much as we could have from the legacy that he has left. But to expect him to continue to be influential now is as bad as to blame him, which is the easy option that many people have. They just blame everything that is going wrong on Tutu and on Mandela. Not everyone, but a few people do. And in the process, what they do is that they take away their own agency, but also the agency of a government that has been in power for 27 years to transform the structures, the economic structures, and the lives of the people. So, you know, sometimes the people who are no longer active are easy targets for blaming. And I've seen that happen a few times. Of course, Tutu was not perfect. He is human. There were mistakes made, some made by him, others were structural mistakes made in the transition from apartheid to the new. Structural mistakes made around the structuring of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, around the persecutions, or rather the prosecutions that were supposed to follow it up, and many other things. So he is by no means perfect. He is very human and has made a few mistakes, but I don't know that we have used as best as we. Thank you.
Thank you, Teniko. I think you can all see the chat message which just was sent, which I regard as important because it says that I think we should not leave out especially from the perspective of the new generation, that we do have a misinterpretation of the work of Desmond Tutu, particularly through the media post-1994, where Tutu's work is represented without notions of justice, and that leads the new generation to reject his work. I think that concurs with what you said, and that is how I also understood you.
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with this. You know, I recently read a book about Mandela, and on the first line of the first chapter of the book, it starts on the day he walks out of prison. It neglects everything that has happened before. And so you have a picture of Mandela that begins the day he walks out of prison. And sometimes the same mistake is done about Desmond Tutu. People start with the TRC as if that is the only thing he has done in life, when in fact, it was the very last thing he did after retirement even. But all these years, he has been insisting that reconciliation cannot be cheap, that reconciliation without justice is empty, that there will be no peace without justice. And he has marched, he has walked, he has confronted, he has written. These are excluded, and the focus is on that picture of Tutu handing over the big.
So we have time and again we have some connection problems, but I think that we could understand what Professor Maluleke said. Can I, in the meantime, ask Mary Pampak? I think you raised your hand, Mary, to make a contribution.
Open. Okay, actually it was Joseph.
Okay, Joseph is.
Hi everybody. I don't expect the old man Desmond Tutu to speak out today, but I expect the other church people. The Archbishop Stephen Breslin, about 3 years ago, made an apology for the silence of the church during times of apartheid. I think the actual president of the Catholic Bishops' Conference in South Africa has shown courage too. But in general, I don't see that the bishops in South Africa, in Mozambique, and in Zimbabwe or Angola have the courage to continue the witness of Tutu.
Thank you. Professor, are you with us?
Yes, I am here.
Okay.
I hope you hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, I heard the last part of the question, and I think that it probably a summary, because the question is, yes, the old man Tutu may no longer be able to speak, but there is the church and there are bishops. And I agree totally. The church has been active and speaking, but I think it has not been speaking clearly. It has not been speaking regularly. It has not been speaking forcefully. And more importantly, it has not often been speaking ecumenically, because that is also very important when the churches come together to speak up. The South African Council of Churches has now begun and to speak out and to also participate in trying to address issues of their country. But I think I agree that the churches could do more than they are currently doing in light of the problems of unemployment, corruption, poverty, and the education system, which continues to have many problems.
Thank you very much. Professor Palava raised his hand.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Maluleke, for this inspiring talk. I enjoyed especially the image of God that you described, the understanding of God that you gave about Tutu. I think it's very close to Gandhi and also close to important thinkers inside different religious traditions. But I would like to follow up on this question of reconciliation and justice. Can you say a little bit more how Tutu thought these two have to go together? In how did it work in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? How did reconciliation and justice go together? I think it would be very interesting to get it with more concrete examples, probably.
Okay, thank you very much. You have asked me a very difficult question. So to begin with, the structure of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was such that it was made of committees. So there was the Amnesty Committee, and there was also the committee that was in charge of the public hearings. And these came together under the leadership of Desmond Tutu. So some of the harshest critics of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission argued that there were actually two commissions. One was the Amnesty Committee, which was headed by a judge, and there were several judges in it. And the other was the public hearings, which was chaired by Tutu himself. And they argued that this was a structural defect in the construction of the commission. Because what this means is that while Tutu had the power to listen to the victims, he did not really have as much power to listen to those who were asking for amnesty. Their fate fell in the hands of the Amnesty Commission, which had to make recommendations, Amnesty Committee, which had to make recommendations to him. Now, of course, the argument is that, you know, either you had what they call, so the form of justice in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came in the guise of amnesty or refusal to give amnesty. That's one way. The second way in which justice came, and there were a few people whose amnesty requests were denied by the commission. It did not give amnesty to everyone who asked for amnesty. The second way in which justice was given was, of course, through the very process of allowing victims to tell their stories to the nation, so that people knew the truth of what actually happened, both as the victims spoke and the people who were applying for amnesty, because they had to tell the whole truth in order to get amnesty. And most importantly, perhaps, justice was supposed to come through the final recommendations of the TRC, which recommendations included both monetary assistance to the poorest of the poor who were victims, who appeared before it, but more importantly, more structural and symbolic reconciliation was supposed to take place in the actual programs of government. So, for example, affirmative action, broad-based economic empowerment, land reform, and all of these were supposed to be areas where justice would be served, and that in good time, the inequality would be lessened, and the land dispossession would also be addressed. But unfortunately, very few of those things went according to plan. Was this enough conceptions of justice that the TRC was operating with? Was it good enough? Did it go far enough? I am not sure that it did, but I think the TRC was obsessed with finding what Tutu always calls a third way that is from either blanket amnesty, where people are just given amnesty without listening to them, without checking whether they qualify, or going the Nuremberg trial route. And this was supposed to be the third way, the middle way. And I'm not sure that the middle way was executed as well as it was intended to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, both of you. There is in the chat, there is a question by a Namibian. If one thinks about the many cruel things which happened to many South Africans who stood up for their rights, what could possibly a compensation for this cruelty be?
Well, the real compensation is a better, more equal, more equitable, more prosperous country. That is the ultimate compensation, the creation of a better country, which until now we have not created. Because let's face it, 5,000 or so victims appeared before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm not sure what the number is, but it's around that. But all South Africans were victims, especially Black South Africans. I mean, we could all have gone there and made our representations, because there's not a single person who was not victimized one way or the other by the apartheid system. So the TRC was itself a symbolic gesture. It could never be a one-to-one account of the wrongs of the past, and the compensation could never be leveled, you know, at only those who appeared before it. So you cannot compensate. But I do think that there were people whose victimhood was so obvious and so apparent that you could not ignore that. I mean, you know, the Craddock Four, for example, the people who were murdered, and many others, the Bikos of this world. So it was and could only be symbolic. The real compensation is the building of a better country in which all of us will be able to say this is our home. I'm afraid to say we are not yet there. We are not yet at that country. We're still looking for that country which will be our home. And that is the ultimate compensation that can be given to the victims of apartheid.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I would ask a question with regard to other principles, the second one, and also the first one actually, because this, what we discussed up to now, reconciliation and justice, is not just a matter in one country. And you indicated that for Desmond Tutu, the issue is also that mankind actually is God's children, not a particular people, a particular country, a particular religion. So what were his thinking of inequalities worldwide? Discrimination happens in other countries too, in other regions. So can we apply his philosophy or his theology actually also on a global scale?
I think we can, at least for people who believe in God, because not everyone believes in God. There are people who would approach these issues from the point of view of human rights. There are people who will approach it from the point of view of intersectional environmental justice. You know, but for people who believe in God, certainly, I think that it's possible to ask why the North continues to discriminate against the South in many ways. It is possible to ask why South Africa continues to discriminate, as some would allege, against some of its own children, even after the end of apartheid. So there are geopolitical issues which we could talk about. But I think, you know, we must not be completely anthropocentric about this. And perhaps this is the dimension that someone like Desmond Tutu did not have the time and the inclination for, because I'm talking about the environmental issues. Because let's face it, Desmond spent the bulk of his life fighting against the evil of apartheid, from the time he was a school teacher to the time he worked for the World Council of Churches. And then when he became a theology lecturer, and then he became a bishop in Lesotho and in South Africa until he became Archbishop. He was focused on the human arrangements, both in South Africa, but also in the world, and perhaps not enough. Although I have heard him give supporting messages at environmental conferences. So what we probably need to do to take his notion of all being God's children further is to think about the whole earth as a created thing whose ecosystem hangs together, so that when the ecosystem is disrespected and dishonored, the danger is not merely that some blacks might kill whites or some men might kill women, which happens, but the danger is that the whole humanity and the whole life as we have known it on earth may be in danger of extinction. And I think this is possible to argue in this direction, building on Desmond Tutu's idea of all being God's children. Thank you.
Ms. Rato Kobe says his work on Ubuntu does deal with the environment. I think that's an important addition.
Yes. Yeah. No, I welcome that. And of course, Ubuntu is something I didn't speak enough about, but I did, you know, this idea about reconciliation and forgiveness in African languages. If I had more time, I would probably have moved further and further into Ubuntu. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, Ili Hanak, but you have to unmute yourself.
Jetzt hört ihr mich?
Ja, jetzt geht's.
What would Tutu say today to the unequal distribution of vaccines and the possibility to get vaccinated between North and South?
Yeah, he would probably, that's a very good question. He would probably say what Cyril Ramaphosa said recently, the president of South Africa. He would call on the North to be less selfish, and certainly not to hoard vaccines and stack them up when the South does not have enough vaccines at all. So I think he would speak to that, but he would also speak about the somewhat the continuing single state mentality that seems to think you can lock out a virus by closing up the borders. Even when the pandemic started, I don't think that made complete sense. Now, even more, the idea that you are locking the virus out by closing your borders is a very questionable one, and I think we should move beyond that. So the whole area of vaccines and the way they have been managed until now is quite problematic. Unfortunately, in our country, there's a great deal of vaccine hesitancy also, which has not helped the situation very much. But it's something that government is working hard on to try and get people to be interested. But these vaccines and these COVID tests and all of these things are not cheap. They are actually very expensive for poor people. So there are many people who just don't afford to go and get the COVID test, even if the test itself is said to be free, but you've got to get yourself to the place where you will get tested. And that costs money to do that. So there are many, many issues of inequality around vaccines, both inside one country, such as ours, but also between countries and geopolitically between the northern and southern hemispheres. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you spoke about this vaccination hesitancy in South Africa and other countries, there is what role do right-wing churches play, like evangelical churches who openly argue against vaccination? I understand that this is a problem in South Africa, but in other countries too.
Yeah, it is a problem, certainly in South Africa. There has been a few prominent church leaders or even influential people like our former Chief Justice who have raised questions obliquely, not directly, about the efficacy of vaccines, and even suggestions that there may be malicious intentions around the vaccines, even though, vaccination has become part and parcel of life for at least the past 150 years in the world. We in South Africa were, like many other countries in the world, hit hard by the Spanish flu, the influenza of 1918. And vaccination was the way we managed to overcome that, and many other diseases. I mean, Desmond Tutu, whom we are talking about, had a bout, I think, of polio at an early age, which is why if you look at one of his hands, it looks a little bit limp because he was almost disabled by that disease. So there's a fascinating South African researcher from the University of Cape Town who wrote many years ago his thesis on the impact of influenza in South Africa and its management. He has since written other books on the impact of pandemics and all the issues around the myths of around vaccines and the resistance around vaccines. And he has shown how in South Africa, unfortunately, vaccines don't have a good name. So, for example, during the Spanish flu, in PE, people were force vaccinated. So they were vaccinated by force, and people were not allowed to travel around some parts of the country if they could not prove that they were vaccinated. And it's one thing to persuade people and to explain the science, which is very clear. But once you force people to do something they don't understand, you just create future resistance and future hesitancy. And so we come out of that history in this country where the pandemic, in fact, it was the influenza pandemic which created the first apartheid residences in South Africa. It was after the influenza and the bubonic plague that blacks were separated from towns and forced to live alone because they were supposed to be too dirty and they were bringing the plague and so on. So all of these things have to be managed and thought about when we talk about the whole question that is going on now around vaccines, and of course the attitude of the North towards the South is not helping the situation very much.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments which people want to raise? I have just received a couple of SMSs which said that people wanted to come in, but for technical reasons they couldn't. So this Zoom and these programs offer us good opportunities, but on the other hand, it also obstacles to some. So I'm sorry that some of interested people could not make it. But from those who are participating now, is there any other question? Eli,
No.
you want it? Okay, it seems that we have covered a wide range. Theology was actually the starting point, and we got insights into the theological thinking of Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. But then you cannot separate theology from life and from politics. And actually, Professor Maluleke, this is your specialty, as I understand. So we covered the whole range of political topics as well, both related to South Africa, but also to global problems, and very up-to-date problems, actually, I would say. So if there is no one raising his or her hand or saying something in the chat, then I would like to express our gratitude on behalf of the Southern Africa Documentation and Cooperation Center in Vienna, Austria, for everyone who participated, asked questions or wrote comments in the chat. And thanks to you, Professor, for taking the time, sharing the evening on a public holiday in South Africa with us, for remembering your students in Austria, or one of your students in Austria, and Professor Kirsten Rütter, actually, who brought us together, linked us up when you came here. So thank you very much for the insights you shared with us, for your wisdom, and I think it was enriching to all of us.
Thank you very much. I was honored to be invited. I really enjoyed the evening. I couldn't have asked for a better evening. Although, you know, if it wasn't for COVID, I would rather come to Vienna because I love the city.
Hopefully you are welcome. Hopefully very soon that this pandemic will be over. But we can only hope as it stands right now. So thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Enjoy the festive season. I would like to wish all of you Happy Christmas, Merry Christmas, and a good start into the new year 2022.